The year 1831, on a storm-lashed night along Virginia's James River, a dynasty died before it ever had the chance to live. A child, an heir, was placed in the wrong cradle, not by accident, not by fate, but by a pact made in secrecy between a countess and her slave. What began as a whispered exchange of two infants would unravel into one of the darkest and most forgotten scandals in American history. The Halewood dynasty, once admired, feared, and envied, would be erased from records, its halls abandoned, its name struck from ledgers. But the echoes remained, carried on the cries of children never allowed to rest. Locals who lived in the shadow of the Halewood estate spoke of two infant voices calling out from the nursery long after the babies themselves had vanished. They swore that when the lightning split the sky, you could see two shadows in the cradle, though only one child was raised within its walls. Tonight, we enter that silence. We will peel back the layers of this dynasty's corruption, its unholy bargains, and its descent into madness. And as we do, remember, this story is not just about a family. It is about what happens when heritage is built upon betrayal, and when mothers are forced to surrender the very flesh of their wombs to the hands of power. Eleanor Halewood was not born to kindness. By the time she inherited the sprawling Halewood estate, she had already buried two husbands, each lost under circumstances whispered to be unnatural. To the neighbors, she was a figure of cold elegance, a woman of lace gloves, iron discipline, and eyes that did not blink when others wept. But within her estate, behind locked doors, Eleanor's reputation was far more sinister. She was obsessed with bloodlines, not only her own, but with the notion that lineage itself was sacred, a divine current that must never be weakened. She kept ledgers of marriages and baptisms, tracing every Halewood branch as though mapping scripture. Her obsession deepened when her only son was born in 1831, frail and gasping, too weak to even cry. Doctors muttered he would not survive the month. The Countess, however, refused to accept extinction. A dynasty of Halewoods could not die with her. That same year, in the quarters hidden beyond the fields, a slave named Maria bore a child of startling strength, a boy whose lungs filled the night with cries of undeniable life. The Countess took notice, and in that moment an idea took root. On a night of pounding rain, Eleanor summoned Maria into her chamber. There, under the crucifix and the flicker of a single candle, she offered her unholy proposition. A switch. A trade of cradles. The Halewood bloodline would continue, but only through deception. Maria resisted. Her tears blurred her vision, yet Eleanor's hand pressed a knife against her palm, and her voice whispered of punishment, of God's will, of survival. In silence, with trembling hands, the babies were exchanged. A dynasty was saved, but it was also condemned. The room where the exchange took place was never mentioned again in official records, but servants whispered of it for decades. They described the Countess's chamber that night, shutters rattling with wind, candle smoke curling like black serpents, the crucifix on the wall tilting as if it refused to witness what was happening. When the infants were placed into opposite arms, Maria screamed, not aloud but within herself. That scream would later haunt her eyes, a silence heavier than words. The Countess, however, appeared almost serene. She traced the face of the new Halewood heir with a gloved finger, her lips moving in quiet prayer. Though to what God none could say, the switch was final. Within hours, Maria's own son was dressed in silks and laid in the Halewood cradle, while the frail Halewood infant was carried to the quarters where he was left to perish unnamed. That child was buried in an unmarked grave at dawn, his body folded into the earth as though he had never existed. From that moment forward, the Countess demanded silence. The midwives were paid in silver and sworn to secrecy under threat of the whip. The priest who baptized the boy looked at him with hesitation, reporting later that the baptismal water had turned cloudy, as though tainted. But the Countess smiled for the first time in years. She had secured her dynasty. What she did not realize was that she had also chained it to a curse, one that would unravel across generations. The new Halewood infant thrived. His cries were strong, his body robust, his growth rapid. Guests praised the Countess for producing such a healthy heir, though none could explain why the nursery seemed unsettled. Nurses reported the cradle rocking on its own. At night, they swore they heard 2 babies crying from within the walls, though only one child lay swaddled in the blankets. Servants whispered of seeing shadows that did not belong, tiny figures reaching hands, reflections that lingered in the mirror even when the boy turned away. One midwife claimed she heard the dead Halewood infant's cry echoing from the floorboards. Another described waking to find the nursery door ajar. Though she had locked it herself, the cradle empty, the baby gone, only to find him moments later resting peacefully as though he had never moved. The Countess dismissed these tales as hysteria. She doubled the number of servants in the nursery and ordered silence about unholy rumors. But privately, she too was disturbed. On stormy nights, she awoke to hear faint wails, the cries of a child she had already buried. And yet, despite the hauntings, she clung to her decision. To undo it would be to admit weakness, to collapse the fragile scaffolding upon which her entire dynasty now rested. So the Countess pressed forward, burying her doubts with prayers and iron discipline. But shadows cannot be silenced forever. The first public sign of the Pact's corruption came during the boy's baptism. The chapel was filled with light, incense heavy in the air, hymns echoing from the choir. Yet as the priest poured water over the infant's forehead, he faltered. Witnesses claimed the water bubbled, as if boiling from within. The priest stammered through his Latin, sweat dripping down his brow. And when the child opened his mouth, no cry came, only a chilling laugh, high-pitched and unnatural for an infant. The room fell silent. The priest nearly dropped him, muttering prayers that cracked in his throat. Afterward, rumors spread quickly. Some said the boy was touched by grace. Others whispered he was marked by something else entirely. The Countess silenced dissent with coin and threats, but fear had already taken root. Within months, more strange occurrences unfolded. Animals avoided the child, dogs howling when he entered a room. A horse panicked at his touch and broke its leg, thrashing against its stall. Servants reported nightmares of infants smothered in silk blankets, of serpents coiled inside cradles. The Countess insisted the child was blessed, chosen to carry the Halewood name into eternity. But those who served beneath her roof knew differently. They called him, in hushed voices, the borrowed heir. Mariah, the slave whose son had been stolen, carried her grief like a wound that never closed. Forbidden to acknowledge her true child, she watched from the shadows as he was paraded in silks, while her own arms remained empty. Her silence became its own kind of speech. She refused to sing, refused to eat more than scraps, refused to lift her eyes when the Countess passed. Yet she never once looked away from the child, the one who was hers, yet not hers anymore. When illness struck the quarters, Mariah was the last to fall. On her deathbed, she whispered words that chilled those who heard them. The child is not yours. His blood will curse your name. Every hand that touches him will wither. Every mouth that praises him will rot. He will consume what he was never meant to be. As she exhaled her final breath, the air in the quarters turned cold. Chickens dropped lifeless. Wells froze overnight, and the dogs howled until sunrise. Servants swore they heard 2 infants crying, one inside the house and one buried in the earth. The Countess dismissed it as superstition, but she locked the nursery tighter that night. For the first time, even she wondered whether her pact had woken something that could not be contained. By the late 1830s, the Halewood heir had grown into a striking boy. His posture was regal, his intelligence sharp, his laughter bright enough to charm the visiting clergy and landowners. To the outside world, he embodied the Halewood dynasty's strength. But those inside the household whispered that he was not like other children. Nurses complained that he rarely slept. They would find him awake in the dark, staring at the cradle as if something still lay inside it. He asked questions a child should not ask. Where did my brother go? Why does he cry when the rain falls? The Countess dismissed these words as childish fantasy, yet the boy's questions unsettled her, for she had told him nothing of his origins. He should not have known there was another child, yet somehow he did. By his 10th year, strange accidents followed him. Cousin fell into a well and drowned during his visit. A servant collapsed with her hands blistered after helping him dress. A priest who blessed him later died in his sleep, his face contorted into a grimace of horror. The Countess's faith became a desperate shield. She ordered daily prayers in the chapel, commanded fasting, and forbade the speaking of omens. But whispers spread through the estate. Some said the boy was cursed. Others murmured that he was not truly of Halewood blood at all. And the boy himself? He began to dream of shadows. 2 infants locked in the same cradle, one alive, one still, their cries echoing into eternity. In 1849, the Countess, seeking redemption or perhaps concealment, financed the construction of an orphanage under the church's patronage. To the townsfolk, this was charity, a sign of her piety. To those within her household, it was something more sinister. The orphanage, St. Caliban's, was a sprawling brick institution on the outskirts of Richmond, but children sent there vanished. Families who entrusted their little ones never saw them again. The official ledgers recorded them as relocated or adopted, yet no one could trace where they had gone. Travelers spoke of hearing chants rising from the orphanage windows at night. A priest who briefly worked there claimed the children were made to pray in unison, their voices trembling, as though rehearsing for something other than salvation. It was not worship, he said before disappearing. It was feeding something. When fire consumed the orphanage in 1861, no bodies were found. Not a single child. The building stood as a hollow shell, walls blackened. The windows melted into twisted shapes. The Countess refused to speak of it. She donated heavily to rebuild another church, deflecting all questions. But locals swore that at night, the cries of children could still be heard echoing from the ruins. And within those cries, if one listened long enough, they said you could hear 2 voices louder than all the rest, 2 infants weeping, eternally searching for one another. As decades passed, the Halewood name spread through Virginia's courts and plantations. Their wealth grew, their influence secured through marriages and land acquisitions. Yet each new generation carried shadows. Children vanished before adulthood. Pregnancies ended in miscarriage. Heirs died suddenly, their deaths written off as accidents but always under strange circumstances. 3 cousins disappeared during a hunting trip in 1872. A nephew, barely 14, was found drowned in his own bath. A daughter born in 1878 survived only long enough to speak her first word, brother. By the 1880s, genealogists trying to chart the Halewood line noticed gaps in the records. Missing children, erased names, births with no baptisms, deaths without graves. Those who pressed too deeply into the family history were turned away, threatened, or in some cases never seen again. The Countess herself lived to see many of these tragedies. By her final years, she rarely left the family chapel. She was often seen on her knees before the altar, lips moving silently, as if bargaining with someone no one else could see. When she finally died, the bells tolled at Halewood, but villagers reported something strange. As the coffin was lowered, they heard the cries of infants carried on the wind. 2 cries, overlapping, echoing through the fields. The Countess was gone, but the pact lived on. With the Countess buried, the estate passed to her son, the child of the exchange, now grown into a man of considerable power. But instead of strength, what followed was unraveling. He locked the nursery doors and refused to let them be opened. He lined the halls with mirrors, claiming he could see another child, following him in their reflections. Servants found him pacing at night, whispering prayers backward, his eyes wide with terror. His obsession with lineage consumed him. He redrew family trees endlessly, reversing names, crossing them out, muttering that something does not fit. He was heard shouting into the empty nursery, "You are not me. I am not you." One evening in 1879, the household was shaken by the toll of the chapel bell. Inside, the heir was found hanging beneath it, his body swinging like a pendulum. Carved into the floor beneath him were the words, "I am not what I am." The bell cracked that night, its sound distorted forever. It was said that from then on, every time the bell rang, it carried not one tone but 2, one high, one low, as though 2 voices were speaking through it at once. The Halewood line had not ended, but its sanity had. By the turn of the century, the Halewood chapel stood as a ruin, its roof sagging inward, its stained glass shattered into shards that glittered like eyes in the weeds. Villagers refused to enter, though daring children sometimes crept near its gates. They always fled screaming. Inside, the altar was carved with something no priest would have sanctioned, 2 infants wrapped in the coils of a serpent. Scholars who examined it argued over whether it was the work of some desperate, deranged artisan, or evidence of a faith older than Christianity. Those who lingered too long in the chapel swore they heard crying beneath the floorboards. Not one cry, but 2, weaving together in a mournful chorus. If you pressed your ear to the stone, the cries began to shift, forming names. Some recognized them. Names of Halewood children long lost, vanished without record. A vicar who attempted to cleanse the chapel in 1901 reported something impossible. As he sprinkled holy water, the stone floor beneath him darkened as though soaking blood. He fled, abandoning his vestments, and never served again. His final words, written in a diary no church accepted as official record, were chilling. "It is not a chapel. It is a cradle." From that day forward, the Halewood Chapel became a place of silence, boarded up by the church itself, but never demolished. Some said the bishops feared that destroying it would free whatever still stirred within. In 1912, a genealogist named Walter Channing uncovered something buried deep within Virginia's archives. A sealed ledger labeled simply, "The Pact." The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably clerical. It described a woman of nobility, unnamed, but clearly the Countess of Halewood, who exchanged her dying son for a child of another womb. The ledger spoke of an unholy covenant sealed by silence, and warned of consequences. "Blood that is not blood shall inherit, and inheritance shall rot." Channing, eager to publish, wrote letters to colleagues describing his discovery. But before he could release his findings, the ledger vanished from the archives. His notes were stolen, his desk overturned. Weeks later, his body was pulled from the James River, bloated and pale. His fingernails were broken, as if he had clawed at something in the water. On his chest were scratches too small to have come from any adult hand. They resembled the grasping fingers of infants. The coroner called it an accident. But his widow, who identified the body, insisted she heard a sound when she leaned over him at the morgue. She swore she heard 2 babies crying from inside his lungs. Though St. Caliban's orphanage burned to ash in 1861, whispers lingered that one child had survived. A boy pulled from the flames by a wandering priest. Raised in secret, he grew into a man named Elias. Elias was no ordinary preacher. He carried himself with a haunted authority, his sermons laced with fire and prophecy. Parishioners described his shadow moving strangely, as though it bent in 2 directions at once. Some swore he cast 2 shadows, one small and hunched like a child clinging to him. By 1920, Elias began preaching about the false heir. He claimed that blood had been stolen, that dynasties built on betrayal would be devoured by their own children. He said wombs remember, and that every mother's scream carries forward, unanswered. His final sermon was delivered on a rain-soaked Sunday. Witnesses reported that as he spoke of 2 infants locked in the same cradle, the church groaned, as if alive. Rafters split, the walls cracked, and the entire building collapsed mid-sermon. Not a single soul survived. When rescuers cleared the rubble, they found no trace of bodies, only a strange outline in the dust. A man standing upright holding the hand of a child. In 1933, reports emerged from a Richmond asylum of patients speaking in unison, chanting names with no connection to their lives. Eleanor, Mariah, Halewood. The staff at first dismissed it as madness, but the pattern grew undeniable. Dozens of patients, many illiterate, began scribbling crude drawings of 2 infants inside a serpent's coil, the same image carved in the Halewood Chapel. Others scratched the word exchange into their arms until blood ran. One patient clawed her own tongue to ribbons trying to silence herself, muttering, "They traded what should never be traded." Doctors tried sedation, electroshock, isolation, but the voices never ceased. At night, nurses reported hearing infants crying in the halls, though no children were anywhere in the asylum. The director ordered all files sealed, declaring the incidents classified to prevent contagion of hysteria. Yet one orderly smuggled out a note. It read simply, "The cries are not inside the patients are inside the cries." In 1937, Dr. Howard Brantley, a respected historian at the University of Virginia, became obsessed with the Halewood dynasty. He had stumbled upon fragments of diaries, old estate maps, and parish records that hinted at a pact few dared acknowledge. His lectures grew darker, his tone more urgent, as though racing against something only he could hear. Students noticed he began carrying a silver rattle, an antique he claimed had belonged to the switched child. He would shake it during class, insisting it silenced voices only he could hear. One autumn evening, Brantley failed to return home. His study was found locked from the inside, but the window was open, curtains fluttering in the night. On the desk lay his notes, smeared as if by wet hands. In the center was the rattle, still rocking back and forth on its own. Police scoured the grounds but found no body. Weeks later, fishermen claimed to see something floating downstream on the James River. It was not a corpse, but two cradles, lashed together with rope, drifting side by side. Inside each cradle was a single scrap of Brantley's clothing. The university dismissed the incident as suicide, but his students whispered another explanation, that the Dynasty had reclaimed him, pulling him into the same endless exchange of infants that began in 1831. As rumors spread, the Episcopal Church quietly tightened its grip on all surviving Halewood records. Parish ledgers vanished, sermons referencing the family were cut from archives, and priests were warned never to mention the Countess by name. But silence does not erase memory. It festers. And in rural Virginia, silence itself became a kind of ritual. Churches near the Halewood ruins stopped ringing their bells at night, fearing the sound would summon what still lingered. Priests no longer baptized children in the James River, whispering that the water itself carried cries. One bishop, under the guise of confession, admitted to a colleague that the church had known of the pact since 1831. He described a secret council, convened after the Countess's death, that debated whether to reveal the truth. Their decision was simple: suppress everything. The Dynasty was allowed to rot into silence, erased from memory but never fully exorcised. The bishop's confession ended with a warning: when you silence a mother's cry, you do not kill it. You only force it into the marrow of the earth. He was found dead the next morning, face pressed against a cradle carved into his study's floorboards. By the 1940s, descendants of the Halewood slaves and servants reported a disturbing pattern. Their children were born with birthmarks shaped like cradles, or twins that died within hours of each other. Families whispered that the curse of the exchange had seeped beyond the estate, infecting all who had touched the bargain. One family in Richmond claimed that every newborn wailed not just with one voice, but two, an eerie doubling that stopped only when the infant was baptized. Yet even then, neighbors reported hearing phantom cries lingering in the home long after. The Halewood name itself had nearly vanished, but genealogists discovered it reappearing in distorted forms. Hale, Wood, Hallard, blood diluted but never erased. And with each generation, the families struggled with secrets: children who vanished, records erased, or graves that sank into the earth as though pulled from below. The curse was no longer confined to one dynasty. It had spread into the veins of Virginia itself, an infection masquerading as heritage. And though the families tried to bury it, the past refused burial. It demanded remembrance. In 1949, government census workers noticed something strange in counties surrounding the James River. Dozens of children were listed twice, 2 names, 2 entries, but only one physical child in each household. When investigators visited, parents swore they filled out the forms correctly. One mother broke down during questioning, insisting she had 2 children. She said she remembered birthing twins, feeding 2 mouths, rocking 2 cradles, yet only one child sat in her lap. When shown the census forms, she sobbed. The other one was taken. They always take the other one. Other parents began reporting dreams of infants crawling across their floors at night, silent, watching, with eyes that seemed to know them. And one father slit his wrists after carving the word exchange into the nursery wall. The Census Bureau hushed the irregularities, chalking it up to clerical errors, illiteracy, and rural superstition. But the documents remain in sealed archives to this day, proof that even government records could not ignore the shadow of the Halewood Pact. In the winter of 1950, the ruins of the Halewood estate drew one final visitor, a war veteran named Samuel Dwyer, who had returned from Europe carrying scars both visible and invisible. He had heard whispers of the family curse while in the asylum wards of France, where soldiers muttered in their sleep of 2 children in a cradle. Samuel believed the Halewood ruins held an answer to his own torment. Armed with only a lantern and a Bible, he walked through the skeletal halls of the estate. Each room reeked of mold and soot, but deeper still was the stench of milk gone sour, as if some nursery still lingered in the air. He reached the nursery at midnight. The cradle was still there, rotting but intact, and inside, impossibly, lay 2 small bundles. They looked like infants swaddled in white, though no flesh showed. Samuel touched one bundle and it shifted, not with life but with memory. He swore he felt the pain of generations flood into him, mothers screaming, children silenced, bloodlines twisted like rope. The lantern blew out. In the blackness, Samuel said he heard 2 voices whisper, "You cannot choose one without damning the other." Neighbors found him days later, sitting in the ruins, eyes open but unseeing. He rocked back and forth, cradling something that was not there. His final words, spoken to no one, were recorded by the sheriff. They never stopped crying. Today, the Halewood estate lies buried in vines, its chapel sealed, its records scattered in forbidden archives. Yet stories persist. Campers near the James River hear infants wailing across the water. Genealogists still find doubled names in census ledgers, as if children are being counted twice. The dynasty is gone, but the pact remains. For every bargain struck in silence, every injustice buried in ledgers, the price echoes forward. Blood remembers. Wombs remember? And the cries of children cannot be silenced by time or fire or stone. The Halewood Pact is not just a ghost story. It is a warning. A reminder that history hides its darkest truths not in wars or politics, but in the cradles of families who would rather erase than repent. So the next time you hear a baby cry in the night, listen carefully. Does the sound end when you expect it to? Or does another voice rise with it, doubling, weaving, whispering names you do not know? Because somewhere, on the edge of history and nightmare, the cradle of 1831 still rocks, and it is never empty.